I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman and the rest of the team. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. Will any of these politicians running for office stand for increasing Social Security benefits that have been frozen for 40 years and make the rich pay for it by a higher Social Security tax on higher income Americans? Don't hold your breath.
We have a jam-packed program today. Our first guest will be Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and an expert on U.S.-Iranian relationships, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Ralph is going to speak to him about the United States' role in Israel's relentless aggression, Israel's continued assaults on the Palestinian population in Gaza, and the new front they've opened up by attacking Lebanon. We look forward to his analysis of the likely repercussions in the region, as well as the risk of blowback in the U.S. Next up, we welcome back Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. He's a trauma surgeon and medical school professor who has done extensive humanitarian work abroad. Earlier this year, he worked at the European Hospital in Khan Yunis, and Dr. Sidwa and 45 other American doctors and nurses who have served in Gaza sent a letter exhorting President Biden, Vice President Harris, and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden to effect an immediate ceasefire. We'll get an update from Dr. Sidwa on what response these physicians have received from the Biden administration. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our ubiquitous corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, Israel is widening its war on Gaza into Lebanon. What are we going to do about it? David?
Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. He is an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Trita Parsi.
Thank you so much, David. Great pleasure to be with you all.
Welcome indeed, Trita. I just saw your recent post on the invasion of Lebanon, which is what it really is: air invasion, booby-trapping, pagers, two-way radios, and other instruments that were infiltrated. And on September 17th, you said, quote, "The more Biden has armed Israel, defended Israel, made excuses for Israel when it has killed Americans, vetoed resolutions at the UN, and accused American critics of Israeli genocide of being anti-Semitic, the more dismissive of U.S. wishes Israel's become. And like clockwork, after Israel has attacked Lebanon or any other country in the region, Biden will launch an extensive campaign to stop the attacked entities from retaliating, while doing nothing to truly prevent Israel from escalating in the first place." And on September 23, listeners, he posted, "Every time Israel escalates and bombs more countries, Biden calls for restraint, yet sends more U.S. troops to the region, protect Israel. Israel can attack but not be attacked. The media calls this Biden's efforts to stabilize matters. In reality, he ensures escalation." And finally, on September 22, you said, quote, "This isn't just genocide," referring to Gaza. "It is a genocide of children. Only way to stop it for the U.S. to stop sending Israel more bombs," end quote. So let's go to the present news. In the last week, over 4,000 Lebanese, most of them civilians, were injured by booby traps, pagers, two-way radios, solar panels, etc., all coming from the Israeli regime. Several dozen were killed. And after that, did Israel stop? No. It continued bombing something like 1,600 targets throughout Lebanon, and already it has killed hundreds of Lebanese, and many of them women and children. And one report out of Beirut said it's almost one half of the total casualty toll from when Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006 for a 34-day war. Now, Leon Panetta, as former director of the CIA, former Secretary of Defense, on CBS News Sunday, called the Israeli attack of pagers and two-way radios terrorism. And he did because it's opened up a whole new window of risk across the world, because who doesn't have pagers and two-way radios and computers and iPhones. So people are dreading it. And it's quite interesting. I'd like to hear your voice on this. He doesn't make a statement like that and say now the whole supply chain around the world is at risk. He doesn't make a statement like that unless the CIA and Pentagon wanted him to make a statement like that. So how do you look at this latest escalation, which is not only geographical, but also technological?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And I'm fortunate that we're talking under these terrible, terrible circumstances. In regards to Leon Panetta's comments, I think let's first remember that if any other entity had done this to Israel or to us, we would not have hesitated for a second. We would have called it an act of terrorism, and we would have called it an act of war. And in that sense, I am pleased to see that someone like Panetta, given his establishment credentials, also made that quite clear on TV. And I do tend to agree with you. I don't think he went out on his skis. I think there is a recognition inside of the American defense establishment that the degree to which Biden has been deferential to Netanyahu and to Israel is beyond anything we have seen in US-Israeli history. And it is ultimately a great danger to the US itself, not only because of the risk of essentially legitimizing these methods that are in contradiction of international law, and we would call it terrorism if others did it, but also because Biden has shown an unbelievable, shocking degree of tolerance for the escalation risk and the escalation that Israel has engaged in, knowing quite well that it is constantly risking, actually designed to drag the United States into a war that the United States should not be fighting, has absolutely no interest in being involved in. And as a result, the United States should have put some clear red lines much earlier on and enforced them to prevent itself from constantly being on the verge of getting dragged into yet another war in the Middle East. But Biden has been unbelievably tolerant of what Netanyahu has been doing and leading him towards this war. And I wouldn't be surprised that there's plenty of folks in the defense establishment that are quite uneasy, if not unhappy about it.
Well, do you foresee in the next few days a ground war with Israeli soldiers? They've been planning all this. This is not something new. They have all kinds of surveillance, all kinds of spies in Lebanon. They have all kinds of total dominance. This media keeps referring to Hezbollah as a powerful force. It's a totally weak force. They have no air defenses. They just sent 140 missiles into Israel. Fortunately for Israelis, no deaths, 6 minor injuries. At the same time, the Israelis have complete control over the skies, complete control over surveillance, over the spies, the informants in Lebanon, and an endless supply of weapons. And it seems like the differential in armed force between Hezbollah and Israel is about what has been between Hamas and the Hamas rockets, which hardly caused any damage, and the Israeli armed forces. Why do you think the media is exaggerating Hezbollah? They've taken tremendous losses. They've been infiltrated. They've been booby-trapped. Their commanders have been killed. Israel seems to know through their espionage where apartment buildings are in, where they have meetings in South Beirut in order to eliminate them. Why is the media, which, by the way, the Post and Times have not had a single editorial condemning the booby-trapping and the act of terrorism in Lebanon, the way Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, did on CBS. Not a single editorial. Why do you think they're exaggerating what is really a very weak Hezbollah? They don't have many cards to play, and that's been quite clear in the last week and a half.
So I think on the one hand, you have an exaggeration of Hezbollah's capabilities in order to portray a constant situation in which Israel is in battle, to kind of sustain the image that Israel is the underdog, even though that does not correspond to reality in any way, shape, or form. And it's used to further justify American support for Israel, armaments, et cetera, et cetera. I do think at the same time that there is a difference, of course, between the capabilities of Hamas and Hezbollah. And we saw that in 2006, in which the Israelis did fail with their ground invasion. And since then, of course, Hezbollah's capabilities have also advanced. But you're quite right. They don't have any air defenses. They don't have any of those things. What they do have, however, which makes them quite different from Hamas, is an ability to actually penetrate Israeli air defenses. Because even though there's not been any reported death, the Israelis have imposed military censorship on the damage that Hezbollah has inflicted on Israel at military sites. Because it's quite clear at this point that Hezbollah has only targeted Israeli military sites, not targeted any civilian sites, unlike the Israelis who are bombing just everywhere. But the Israelis have put in a military censorship on that, so we don't have an entirely clear image of exactly what has happened. What I think we can see, however, based on the little reporting that has occurred, is that there actually has been some significant damage to Israeli military installations. But most importantly, both them and the Iranians have shown their ability that they actually can get through Arrow 1, Arrow 2, David Sling, Iron Dome, Patriot. And those are billions of dollars of investments, frankly, billions of dollars of American taxpayers' money that has been given to Israel that ultimately provides a degree of protection, but is in no way, shape, or form a perfect shield for the Israelis.
It's true that Hezbollah has advanced missiles to use, but their hands are tied. They've used the least advanced missiles, and most of them have been shot down by the Israelis.
They don't want a war. I mean, after 11 months, it's absolutely clear. It was clear in the first month. Hezbollah doesn't want a war with Israel. Iran doesn't want a war with Israel. The Houthis are a bit of a different story, but Israel, from the outset, had plans for an invasion of Lebanon. The Biden administration claims that they dissuaded the Israeli government from doing so, but the early mobilization that we saw was largely geared towards invading Israel. Right now, they have called out the orders for mobilization of 3 divisions. This would still take some time before those are ready, but 3 divisions is not enough for an actual ground invasion of Lebanon. That's actually the amount of troops they had last time around, and that was an utter failure in 34 days. So if they're planning for a larger ground invasion, we have not yet seen clear signs of the preparation for that. But as you pointed out quite correctly, this is an air invasion. They're targeting plenty of sites all the way up to Beirut and Beirut itself. This is all clearly a declaration of war without the actual declaration. Now, there's plenty of rumors flying around right now that there is a potential 21-day cessation of hostilities that is being prepared, and it may be achieved in the next couple of hours or days. That would obviously be quite welcome by particularly the civilian population in Lebanon, who has been suffering tremendously. The vast majority of those killed in Lebanon have been civilians. According to the Lebanese health minister, who is not part of Hezbollah, it is actually all of the casualties so far in the last 2 days of bombings actually been civilians.
Well, let's talk about Lebanon itself, not just Hezbollah. This is war on Lebanon that has a dysfunctional government, to be sure, but it is a state that the U.S. is allied with in a way, supplying modest weapons to the weak Lebanese army. And France has had long relations with Lebanon, going back to the Mandate period. In the U.S., this is a whole new constituency where they're losing relatives and friends. Lebanese Americans include retired generals, major business figures, major academic figures, major religious officials. Do you think they're mobilizing to put pressure on the Biden administration to stop this? I haven't seen many signs. We're talking with Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute, executive director.
So we have seen in the last 11 months a tremendous amount of public pressure on the Biden administration to end the war in Gaza, stop sending shipments of weapons, stop protecting Israel and enabling Israel to continue the slaughter. And we have seen zero responsiveness from the Biden administration to these demands. And these are demands that are coming from people that are in many ways at the very center of Biden's winning coalition from 2020. And he's been completely disregarding them. So I sense that a lot of folks have just given up on the idea that Biden is going to be responsive to any of these type of pressures. The question is if pressures on Kamala Harris can have some impact. We saw earlier on that she gave a very different message and tone in the way that she spoke to Israel and about Israel. But since then, she has quickly backed off of that. And what happened at the DNC, of course, is well known to everyone, in which not even a Palestinian American was allowed to speak at the convention. So we're in a very sad situation in which we have a president who has been sitting on the front lines of American foreign policy for 1/5 of America's history, who thinks that he knows everything best and clearly doesn't seem to be listening to anyone. And there's plenty of discontent inside the Biden administration itself. And people appear to have just given up and are waiting for the elections. But there's no clear signs yet that there won't necessarily be much of a change even after that.
I want to ask you about another aspect of Biden's abdication, and that is he hasn't even demanded from Netanyahu to open Gaza up to U.S. reporters who are banned, along with all foreign reporters and Israeli reporters, from going in as war correspondents and independently covering what's going on in Gaza. And this is pretty extraordinary because all Biden has to say to Netanyahu is, you open them up tomorrow, American taxpayers want to know what's going on there. How do you explain this pathetic, pitiless abdication by this weak president of ours in this issue?
It's absolutely shocking, I have to say. It's acting against his own self-interest. Complete abdication, as you put it. But it's not just his abdication. I would say that it's also the abdication of much of the Democratic establishment that has been going along with this.
Let me interject here. In July, the mainstream corporate press put a full-page ad demanding access to Gaza. We're talking about the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, AP, BBC, Agence France, all the major professional associations, 76 signatures. So here Biden has to support the entire corporate press. Open up Gaza. Why are you allowing Netanyahu to block reporters from going into Gaza, which he's done for years, by the way, including Israeli reporters, from freely reporting? Don't you think it would change the dynamics of what the Israelis could do in Gaza?
Absolutely. And this is part of the reason why, of course, the administration doesn't seem to be pressing for it. In fact, it was even reported, I believe it was in Politico, that prior to the 6-day ceasefire that we had last November around Thanksgiving, as you recall, in which there was 6 days of a ceasefire in Gaza, a lot of the hostages were released during this period, that the Biden administration hesitated about going along with the ceasefire because they were fearing that once there was a ceasefire, journalists would get into Gaza and they would see the carnage. And seeing the carnage, reporting the carnage, would then further fuel opposition amongst Biden's own Democratic base to the war. So the administration is well aware of what's going on. They have an interest themselves in hiding it from the American public. And we saw just the other day, ProPublica had an absolutely stunning piece that revealed that the State Department's own investigations show that clearly the Israelis were preventing food from coming in, and that this violated US law, and that this would mean that there would be consequences, and the United States needed to prevent further arms sales, etc., because of American law. And then Tony Blinken goes a couple of days later and testifies to the contrary and essentially lies to Congress about what the evidence is and what the conclusion and analysis of the State Department itself has been on this point. So they're as complicit as Netanyahu, and as a result have an interest in hiding as much as Netanyahu has.
Let's go to the undercount. Everybody knows there's a vast undercount, and Hamas doesn't want the real count because they don't want to be assailed by their own people for not being able to protect them and provide shelters. Of course, Netanyahu likes that undercount. More and more, it seems there's over 300,000 deaths.
There is absolutely no doubt, I would say, that there is an undercount. Whether it is, the Lancet estimation was to about 186,000 was a conservative estimation, but it was up until June. Newer numbers based on the same analysis would put it exactly where you put it, somewhere around 300,000. Let's put that in context of what we know happened in Ukraine and how strongly Biden administration reacted to that, very quick to call it war crimes, very quick to call it a genocide, calling out the Russians for shooting and bombing schools and hospitals, finding that to be absolutely unacceptable. But when the Israelis are doing it, it's a completely different story. In Ukraine, in over 2.5 years, about 700 children have been killed. None of them should have been killed. This was an illegal invasion. But in Gaza, we're talking about more than 10,000 in 11 months. And the reaction of the Biden administration is diametrically opposed. There is a reason why the Biden administration more or less has stopped using the word or the term rules-based international order, a term that they absolutely loved, used it consistently and constantly on Ukraine. They have more or less stopped using it since October 7th because the hypocrisy, the double standard is just so blatant. So they themselves have come to recognize it and are no longer using that term.
Well, the death toll in Gaza now exceeds the combined death toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Dresden, which was 240,000 during World War II. Before we get to the biggest issue as we conclude, which is blowback, which is being assessed now intensively in the CIA, NSA, and Department of Defense, that's their word, blowback against the U.S. by what we're supporting and destroying over there, whole extended families wiped out. Give our listeners a minute and a half on why Iran fears the U.S., starting with the overthrow of their prime minister.
So the history between the United States and Iran tends to start in the American mind in 1979 when the Iranians students take American hostages from the embassy for 444 days. In the Iranian mind, it starts back in 1953 because that's when the United States overthrew the democratically elected prime minister of Iran. Iran was an embryonic democracy at the time, gave the Shah all powers, and he ended up actually becoming a much, much more brutal dictator after the coup and reigned for another 25 years. Since then, of course, both countries have a long list of sins against each other. The United States did support Saddam Hussein during the Iraq-Iran war. It was seen partly as a revenge against what the Iranians had done with the hostages. But since the mid-1990s, Iran has been under a tremendous amount of sanctions by the United States that has devastated their economy. The United States has bases all around Iran. We've seen the assassination of generals, including Soleimani, etc. Threats of war with Iran were daily on the news in the United States in the 2000s. Every day there was a debate, should we bomb Iran, should we not bomb Iran? So the Iranians perceive the United States as their number one threat, the fear of invasion, the fear of regime change, the fear of what happened during the Trump administration, which the Trump administration was deliberately seeking to destabilize the country and to a certain extent actually succeeded in doing so.
And fully backing Israel's sabotage inside Iran.
Oh, yeah, the United States was part of the Stuxnet, for instance. Of course, the Israelis have done a lot of other assassinations and sabotage inside of Iran. The extent to which the U.S. has been involved is perhaps unclear, but certainly the U.S. has not been particularly objecting to it. You have right now a new president in Iran who has brought back the team that negotiated the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated between the U.S. under Obama, Iran, and a couple of other countries. They're sending very clear signals that they want to go back to it. They want the U.S. to go back to it since the U.S. left it. They're willing to renegotiate it. They're willing to go with a new deal. It doesn't have to be the exact same deal as before. Clear signals of wanting talks. We're not seeing any reciprocity right now, of course, because of the elections, but it's also unclear to me as to whether a Harris administration or certainly a Trump administration would actually pick up on the opportunity that exists to be able to reduce tensions with Iran.
Let's go back to blowback now, which is the fear by the defense establishment in the U.S. that the war is going to come to the U.S. in terms of retaliation, like 9/11 or worse. What's the Quincy Institute knowledge about all that?
Well, the degree to which Biden's support for Israel's slaughter in Gaza has angered people in the Middle East and beyond, isolated the United States on the international stage, and fueled hatred of the United States, I don't think is anywhere near close being comprehended in the US right now. And I fear that we will see blowback, we will see attacks, we will see other measures against the United States. And it will very much be because of what has happened in Gaza, particularly when the full picture of the human suffering in Gaza comes out. This is part of the reason I'm so stunned to see that Biden is doing this, because even if he doesn't care about Palestinian lives, and I do believe that he doesn't really seem to care about that at all. It doesn't seem to have the capacity to have empathy for the Palestinians. He should nevertheless care about American lives. And I think what he's doing in Gaza and increasingly in Lebanon is also putting the United States in danger.
We've been speaking with Trita Parsi, the executive director of the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. Before we conclude, Trita, is there anything else you'd like to say that we haven't asked you about?
No, I think this was a great conversation. I just re-emphasize the last point. I think the most important point from the American perspective is to make sure that we don't get dragged into another war, unnecessary war in the Middle East. That certainly does not serve our interests. And I fear that the approach that the Biden administration has pursued is one that is putting us constantly on the verge of getting dragged in. And we're getting in an even more dangerous situation right now. And for that reason alone, this absolutely has to be stopped.
You see things as bad or worse under a Trump regime?
It's a tough question, but I would have to say this. I don't think Trump would have any empathy whatsoever with the Palestinians. I don't see him necessarily having it with a lot of other Americans. I do think he would have taken the escalation risk more seriously because he does seem to be very disinclined to get dragged into wars that doesn't serve his personal interests. And this one I don't think does. So this, I think, is a very crucial difference between the two of them. But in many other ways, he could have also been worse.
And how can people get more information from the Quincy Institute? Can you give us the website slowly?
Yes, it's Quincy Institute. The website is QUINCYINST, short for institute.org.
Thank you very much, Trita Parsi, Executive Director of the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. To be continued.
Thank you so much.
We've been speaking with Trita Parsi. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we welcome back Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 27, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Justice Department last week filed a civil claim against Grace Ocean Private Limited and Synergy Marine Private Limited, the Singapore corporations that owned and operated the container ship that destroyed the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. In the early morning hours of March 26th, the motor vessel Dolly left the port of Baltimore bound for Sri Lanka. While navigating through the Fort McHenry Channel, the vessel lost power, regained power, and then lost power again before striking the bridge. The bridge collapsed and plunged into the water below, killing 6 people. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest is a doctor who worked in Gaza and signed onto a letter urging the Biden administration to use its leverage with Israel's Netanyahu government to demand a ceasefire. That was in July. Let's get an update. David?
Dr. Feroze Sidhwa is a trauma and critical care surgeon, as well as a Northern California Veterans Affairs general surgeon, and he is associate professor of surgery at the California North State University College of Medicine. Dr. Sidhwa served at the European Hospital in Khan Yunis in March and April of this year, and he has done prior humanitarian work in Haiti, the West Bank, Ukraine, and Zimbabwe. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Feroze Sidhwa.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Feroze. Listeners, this is going to be a pretty remarkable narrative that you're going to hear now. Almost 50 doctors who have come back from Gaza, risking their lives to help Palestinian doctors and nurses and staff in crumbling hospitals under attack by the Israelis, have wrote a letter on July 25th, 2024, to President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris and Dr. Jill Biden. And just to give you a flavor of what they observed, here is Dr. Mark Perlmutter, orthopedic and hand surgeon. Quote, Gaza was the first time I held the baby's brains in my hand, the first of many, end quote. Then there's Dr. Feroze Sidhwa himself. Quote, I've never seen such horrific injuries on such a massive scale, with so few resources. Our bombs are cutting down women and children by the thousands. Their mutilated bodies are a monument to cruelty, end quote. Then there's Dr. Thalia Pachi-Yanakis, an obstetrician and gynecologist. Quote, I saw so many stillbirths and maternal deaths that could have easily been prevented if the hospitals had been functioning normally, end quote. And the last quote by Asma Taha, pediatric nurse practitioner, quote, every day I saw babies die. They had been born healthy. Their mothers were so malnourished they could not breastfeed, and we lacked formula or clean water to feed them, so they starved, end quote. Let me ask you the first obvious question our listeners are thinking about. Did the Biden White House, did President Biden, any of his staff, Dr. Jill Biden, any of her staff, or Kamala Harris, Vice President, respond?
No, unfortunately, I did not get a response from anybody in the White House. I got some people were able to give me some national security staffers and stuff like that. Some of them did respond just with boilerplate. The Biden administration continues to work on a ceasefire sentence, but there was no substantive response from anybody and no response at all from the White House, or there was no Harris campaign back then. But yeah.
Well, see, this, listeners, is another characteristic of the White House as a monarchy. A dictatorial monarchy. It doesn't encourage Congress to assert its constitutional authorities. It spends money any way it wants abroad. It destroys anything it wants abroad, not just Gaza with their proxy Israel. These are doctors who've been all over the world in the most dire situations, seeing horrific casualties. But I think most of them have never seen anything like Gaza. 2.3 million people crammed together before October 7th, destitute under an Israeli illegal embargo, inadequate food, high levels of anemia among the children, inadequate medicine, basically the world's largest open-air prison, unable to leave and barely able to survive. So let me ask you another question. These are youngsters. Many of the fatalities, I've estimated over 300,000 deaths so far, and even more coming, even if there's a ceasefire. There's so much disease and trauma and untreated wounds and infections. Every day, day after day, these children are subjected to the deadly whining of drones night and day. They're subjected to explosions in their schools, in their hospitals and clinics. They're subjected to bombs. 55,000 tons of bombs, the Israelis now estimate, have been dropped on this tiny enclave about the geographical size of Philadelphia. What's the assessment of their lifelong mental damage here? This is trauma of unprecedented severity and frequency.
Yeah, it really is. There is no time, I think, in all of history that I can think of, at least. If somebody can correct me, I'd love to know another example where a captive population made up of half children. Gaza is 51% of kids, of the people in Gaza are under 18 years of age, and about 40% are under 15 years of age. There's never been anything like this where that population has been penned inside of a wall on the eastern and northern side, a wall on the southern side, and the sea with gunships on it on the western side. Their airspace, their electromagnetic spectrum, even their population registry, everything is controlled from the outside by the United States and Israel. And since October 7th, that's last year, that's really been, that control has been used to impose starvation, destruction of the water infrastructure, and just massive destruction of the educational infrastructure. Really just pretty, it's hard to appreciate me, but really just literally everything in Gaza that makes a place a society has been destroyed. I kind of think of it in like three levels, I guess. Like at the very base is agriculture, food production, and housing. At the level above that is healthcare, and at the level above that is things that are for a higher level of society: education, arts, industry, whatever. That top level is gone. Literally every university in Gaza has been obliterated, physically destroyed. Almost none of it during fighting, all of it in controlled demolitions afterwards when there was no fighting. The hospital system is almost completely useless right now. It's not literally, it's better to have 4 walls to give birth in than 3 walls. But the functionality of the hospitals is very little more than a 4-walled space in which people can walk into and ask for a doctor to put bandages on them. And then even the lowest level, Oxfam, I think I might have mentioned it last time I was on your program, Oxfam wrote a report called Water War Crimes. That is, it has to be read to be believed. It's just shocking. It's something like 85 or 90% of the water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed. I can't remember which UN report it was just a few weeks ago that reported that the average cost of a 75-gram bar of soap in a market in Gaza right now is $10 US. The estimate in that report was that an unskilled worker, please forgive me if I have the numbers exactly wrong, but the estimate was that an unskilled worker in Gaza, if they were employed, which of course they're not right now, an unskilled worker would have to spend 60% of their income just to acquire adequate hygiene products for them and their family. Can you imagine anything?
Well, we know.
But Ralph,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
it's the violence, it's the starvation campaign, it's the widespread killing. I mean, there has never been a campaign of killing like this directed at children. All of this is combining to lead to children who, I actually just, for another project, I just conducted a poll of American healthcare workers workers who've been back from Gaza. I can't remember what percentage, but I think it was about 80% agreed with the statement that I'm paraphrasing. The violence and deprivation in Gaza is so severe that I regularly saw children who were suicidal and wished they had died with their families. That's outrageous. That doesn't exist anywhere else. So yeah, this is torture and torment of an entire society, which again is half kids. So yeah, that's going to happen, and it's going on a year now, leaving aside what Gaza was on October 6th of 2023, which is something take a long time to talk about, but it wasn't a pretty place. This is horrendous. And of course, it's going to have absolutely detrimental effects on the development of children, on their mental health, on their capacity for empathy, on their capacity to learn. And that's assuming they survive. So yeah, no, this is an awful and devastating problem that's going to have a generational effect. Even if it stops right now, it's going to have a generational effect.
Yeah. And these are American bombs, American tax dollars, and Biden's shielding of the Israeli genocidal regime day after day, diplomatically, politically, before the United Nations. He hardly mentioned the horrors in his speech at the United Nations the other day.
There's a ProPublica article that really everyone should read from, I think maybe yesterday or the day before, about how the Biden administration deliberately undermined the US's own accountability mechanisms. In other words, it's not only corrupting the UN, all the rest of the world nobody cares about, but it's even corrupting its own internal processes that are supposed to function. A lot of it is focused on that NSN 20 report. That was the State Department report back in, I can't remember, July, August, something like that. That was meant to discover whether or not Israel is violating the myriad US laws on provision of assistance to foreign governments that violate international humanitarian law. There are tons of these laws. There's the Leahy law, there's the Foreign Assistance Act, something like that. But there's plenty of them. And this article has to be read to be believed. The State Department, Blinken specifically, they overruled their own experts. Both USAID and the State Department's Refugee Department, I believe it is, or Department of Population, something like that, which handles refugees. That's the department Stacey Gilbert resigned in over protest of this nonsense. They just changed their conclusions. And they, ProPublica doesn't put it that way, but that's clearly what happened. They just said, no, these conclusions that Israel is blocking USAID are politically inserviceable to us because we want to continue arming Israel. So we're going to just change them, and we're going to just make this report say what we want it to say. So this is just outrageous. I mean, why are we doing this even to ourselves? Is it worth corrupting the entire executive department of the United States so that we can murder more children? Is that what Americans want? I don't think so.
Well, we'll see. Forthcoming are the two Inspector General reports, according to the Washington Post, from the Defense Department, State Department, and they're supposed to be telling the truth. So we'll see how strong those reports are about the illegalities that you just mentioned and other extraordinary departures from the rule of law and from whatever appropriations standards these two departments are supposed to be observing. This letter didn't get as much media as I thought it would get. After all, you came back with eyewitness accounts from Gaza, from which U.S. reporters are banned. All Western reporters, Israeli reporters, cannot go into Gaza because of Netanyahu's years-long prohibition. He doesn't want to have reporters freely reporting what's going on in that tiny, surrounded, embargoed enclave. You got some CNN, you got an article in The Guardian, but it should have been front and center in the Washington Post, New York Times, AP, Reuters, which, by the way, illustrates the devaluation of Palestinian lives, not only the devaluation of what you and other courageous doctors have documented. In fact, you said on another occasion that the doctors hardly met anyone, with very few exceptions, in Gaza who isn't sick or injured, apart from the ones who have died or on the verge of starvation death. You're now preparing another letter. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so my skills as an organizer are quite lacking. So that last letter, I was scrambling at the last minute because it was, it just made sense to release it on July 25th. That was the day after Netanyahu's speech, if you want to call it that, to Congress. So I was only able to find about 44 other healthcare workers who worked in Gaza to sign it. But since then, we've kept gathering signatures, and now we have almost 100. I'm hoping we'll have more than 100 by the time it's signed. Honestly, it says mostly the same thing because nothing's changed. Things have only gotten worse. We also released a very long appendix to the letter, which is really just meant as more of a reference for reporters and people who are interested in it. I do know plenty of reporters from major papers in the US who have called me or gotten in touch with me anyhow and asked me about the details of the appendix, the details of the letter. So there are reporters who are very good and they're very interested and they want to report on these things. And when I ask them why they haven't, they usually say their editors have this absolutely absurdly high standard for what has to be met. And like you mentioned CNN, actually we were on Amanpour, which I believe is on CNN International. And we were on, it was me and Dr. Perlmutter, the Jewish American hand surgeon that you mentioned earlier. He and I were in Gaza together. I've become good friends since then. And he and I were on the Amanpour show, and Christiane Amanpour wasn't on that day. I'm kind of curious what it would have been like if she had been. But the anchor who was on, I forget her name. She's a Moldovan woman, smart lady. Between every time we would go from me to Mark, she would interject and say, "Oh, and we want to point out that CNN can't independently confirm what Dr. Perlmutter and Dr. Sidwa are saying. And we reached out to the IDF and they had no comment. They said everything's a lie." It's like, why are you being a spokesperson for the IDF? This is very strange behavior. If the Russian military doesn't respond, do you point out that you can't independently verify crimes that the Ukrainians are reporting? Or if there was a Western doctor in the Donbass working there who reported a massacre in the Donbass by Russian troops, would you say, "Oh, we can't independently confirm"? What are you talking about? I am the independent confirmation. This is absurd. It was such a bizarre experience. I didn't know what to do at it.
What are these letters demanding of the Biden administration?
So the original letter had several points. The major ones were obviously to stop arming Israel so it can't keep doing these things. Beyond that, it was there are several restrictions that Israel imposed on even the traveling of humanitarian workers to Gaza after Israel took and destroyed the Rafah crossing on May 7th. So at that point, if listeners don't understand it, at that point, there was no connection to Gaza with the outside world that Israel didn't control. So now Gaza was literally 100% under the control of Israel. And at that point, they said no doctor of any Palestinian descent can go into Gaza. That's been enforced sporadically. Some have actually gotten in, but that's the restriction. This is told to the WHO, and so then the WHO actually started enforcing this, which is just crazy. I mean, that's outrageous. And so we asked for that to be reversed. We asked for humanitarian aid that is bound for Gaza to be inspected by an independent entity, not by the Israeli army, which again just makes sense. Nobody thinks Russia should be inspecting aid that goes into the Donbass. Why should Israel be inspecting aid that goes into Gaza? It's just absurd. And as the Washington Post, as CNN, as American senators like Van Hollen, who is there, the other one, Markley, I think, have given speeches about on the Senate floor. They've seen Israel with their own eyes in Rafah. They've seen Israel arbitrarily denying aid for clearly no reason. They saw warehouses full of aid that should have been delivered that was just completely arbitrarily denied. If anybody's interested, that Washington Post article about what is denied and what isn't is absolutely shocking. Children's toys, medical scissors, just all sorts of ludicrous nonsense that just couldn't possibly be any security justification for it. So that was another thing was that we asked that these humanitarian corridors be opened up, but not allowing Israel this bureaucratic runaround that is the main mechanism by which they're blocking aid. And the new letter is basically going to reiterate those demands, but also ask primarily for a meeting between us and the Biden and Harris administration, because what's going on right now is just absolute insanity, and it cannot be allowed to continue.
What about the doctors in the United States? Have the medical associations started to speak out? The American Pediatric Association did. The American Public Health Association did. Pretty modest protests, but what's your read of your profession's medical societies, which you and others have been trying to get to take a stand here?
We have. The American Medical Association voted down even a ceasefire resolution, which I was pretty surprised by. I don't know of any direct contacts with the American College of Surgeons, but that's the kind of thing that we're trying to work on. The American Medical Association effort was spearheaded by Code Pink, which, they do good work, but they do it in their way, which is really to get in people's faces and be pretty aggressive, which isn't always wrong. Maybe even isn't even usually wrong. But I think in the case of approaching medical associations, it's probably a different tactic. Will work a little bit better, and we're going to keep working on that.
What makes you do this? and your colleagues. This is incredible what you've done over the years all over the world. What makes you do this?
Me personally, I don't know. It's when I was in my freshman year of college is when the Second Intifada broke out in the Palestinian territory, and I didn't know anything about the world as an 18-year-old kid. So you start learning, you start reading, and it's something I ended up sticking with. And it's hard to learn about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians without realizing that it's kind of a overall consequence of U.S. control over the world. So I felt like it's important for me to do work in my professional area that also complements my vision of a world where people can actually make their own decisions instead of having them made by force from Washington.
You also have great empathy for your colleagues working over there who are natives of these lands. For example, you say you quickly learned, quote, that our Palestinian healthcare colleagues were among the most traumatized people in Gaza, and perhaps in the entire world, end quote. It's well known the Israeli military has killed hundreds of healthcare workers in Gaza. They've killed over 170 journalists, over 200 people working for the United Nations Relief. I mean, nothing is out of bounds. But describe, how do these Palestinian healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, they have nothing to work with hardly, people pouring in various states of dismemberment and blood. How can they keep going, having lost their own members back home in other bombings?
Yeah, just to give people a sense of scale, I believe it was June 26th was the last time that Medical Aid for Palestinians updated their count of Gaza healthcare workers who've been killed. At that time, it was 500. That was the 500th healthcare worker who was known to have been killed. But just a few days ago, maybe last week, the Ministry of Health actually released the names of almost 1,000 healthcare workers who've been killed. I think it's 969, if I remember the number exactly. And then they said they suspect another 150 or 200 are dead and another 200 are in Israeli detention, which basically means disappeared. 3 Palestinian physicians have died in Israeli custody, and not after like a day, not like, oh, they were shot while they were getting arrested and then they died, the next day or two. This after months in captivity. That's shocking. I mean, these weren't infirm people to begin with. What are the Israelis doing? Every released Palestinian who has seen Palestinian physicians in Israeli detention has said that they are specifically being targeted for torture, for torment, and for humiliation in front of other Palestinians. Yeah, maybe we haven't, but we should have read the reports about literal rape of Palestinian detainees in the Sidwa Yemen and other torture facilities that the Israelis are using. And the widespread torture of Palestinians is not new, unfortunately. The Public Committee Against Torture in Israel reported, back in 2004 or 5, that the number of Palestinian detainees, I'm quoting almost exactly, the number of Palestinian detainees against whom no method of ill treatment or torture was used is negligible. And it's important to remember I think it's something like almost half of Palestinian males have been arrested at some point by Israel. That means almost half of Palestinians have been tortured by the Israelis. That's just wild. Again, there's just nothing similar to this. And so the effect on the healthcare workers is dramatic. And then on top of that, they're no different from the rest of the Palestinians. In fact, they're even more heavily targeted in some ways. Actually, a 23-year-old medical student that I knew, Abdul Rahman al-Najjar, was blown up in the house he was staying at on August 30th. That's the same day that Hersh Goldberg-Polin is thought to have been killed. If you look at their pictures, they look identical.
There are over 10,000 hostages, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails who've gotten very little attention compared to the 100 hostages that Hamas took on October 7th. And this preceded October 7th as well as afterwards. They're arresting people from the West Bank, some of them women and children from Gaza, and throwing them into these Israeli jails, as you pointed out. But there are not any rules of engagement here by the Israeli military for their own soldiers in Gaza. It's just shoot to kill anybody you want. They have snipers shooting them in the back. People are desperately trying to rescue their loved ones under the debris after a building was bombed. They shoot into hospitals, into patients, into maternity wards, what's left of them. And here's an example of how out of control. Just recently, Israeli soldiers saw a man who they thought was a Palestinian. and they drilled him with 400 bullets, except that he was not a Palestinian. He was an Israeli soldier.
Yeah, I think we should all recognize that the Israeli military is allowing its soldiers to do whatever they want in Gaza. A lot of it is also, and it's not just like the bad actors. That's not it either. Like random soldiers don't decide what to bomb from the air. That's a coordinated, high-level decision. But leaving aside that the massive destruction of Gaza was an Israeli policy decision. The Israeli military is consciously choosing not to stop its soldiers from doing things like you just mentioned, not to stop its soldiers from shooting children. This is one of the points we made in the letter, and that we'll make again. Almost everybody who has been to Gaza, almost every single physician and nurse who's been there since October 7th, has on a daily basis seen children who were shot in the head. I don't mean like 17 and a half year olds. I mean the young children, visibly identifiable as children, every day throughout Gaza in the catchment area of every single hospital. Well, the Israeli military is very sophisticated. They have video surveillance. Almost all of their soldiers wear body cameras. I believe the sniper scopes and things have video recording equipment. They know exactly who they're shooting. There's no question about it. If they don't, I know that our letter and the appendix to the letter, which details these things in excruciating detail, has been downloaded in Israel. I know it's been read there. I can see where it's been downloaded. So it's not like they don't know, but they're consciously choosing to ignore it. Well, that's the same thing as setting policy. You know it's happening, you don't stop it. And it's not like it's been happening for a week, it's been happening for a year. So yeah, there are no rules of engagement. The use of Palestinians as human shields by the Israeli military is something else that someone at some point will write a history of American media coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and no rational person will believe that it could have been this mendacious. The use of human shields by Israel, even just in the past year, including children, and not even only in Gaza, especially including, in fact, in particular in the West Bank, is shocking. It's on video. It's oftentimes on Israel's own body cam videos, which for some reason, I don't know how they've actually been released. I'm not sure about that. And beyond that, it's not just sending, say, a Palestinian to go knock on the neighbor's door, the so-called neighbor procedure. The Israeli military is actually dressing up. And again, this is all video documented. There's no question about it whatsoever. The Israeli military is putting Palestinians in Israeli military uniforms and marching them through buildings to see if someone will shoot at them, to see if they'll trigger a booby trap. This is outrageous. It's crazy. I mean, and then on the flip side, when they say Hamas or whoever is using human shields, it's almost laughable, because why would the Palestinians think that the presence of Palestinian civilians will stop the Israeli military from blowing something up? It's just ridiculous. It doesn't stop them anywhere else. They drop these huge bombs on tents. They shoot children in the head constantly. Why would they be hesitant about blowing up this or that civilian? It's just ridiculous.
Well, much of this is being documented by 17 Israeli human rights groups, Refuseniks, Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, Rabbis for Human Rights, the
Physicians for Human Rights Israel. Yep.
Yeah, and they're trying to do their part, but you can imagine what it's like trying to speak the truth as Israelis in Israel through these groups. I want to read the last 2 or 3 lines of your letter to Joe Biden and Dr. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You say, "We are simply physicians and nurses who cannot remain silent about what we saw in Gaza. Every day that we continue supplying weapons and munitions to Israel is another day that women are shredded by our bombs and children are murdered with our bullets. President Biden and Vice President Harris, we urge you, end this madness now," end quote. You're echoing what Jill Biden told Joe Biden in December after watching slaughtered children pictures. Stop it now, Joe. That's where her exact words were, according to President Joe Biden himself. And he ignored it the way he ignored your letter. That's the kind of president we have, listeners. Not even the courtesy of responding to the letter, much less meeting with a delegation of these brave doctors.
These things seem hopeless and overwhelming. And it's almost like, what can I do in the face of this kind of just absolute monstrosity, just this kind of behavior? How do I think about this kind of thing? What I would encourage people to do is just not think about it all that much. What's actually going on? You know what's going on. Just accept that it's horrible. and think about what you can do about it. And we can do a lot about it because it's our funding that is the crucial aspect of all of this. There's actually a Haaretz article about this from maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Israeli military absolutely cannot continue its assault on Gaza, on Lebanon, on anyone else without the backing, the full-throated backing of the United States. If we just stop sending the weapons, the killing stops, and they actually have to come to some kind of negotiated settlement. So that's our task. Don't let yourself get drowned in how terrible it is, because it is terrible. And I understand as a trauma surgeon, I see a lot worse stuff in the world than most people do, and it's really overwhelming. But don't let that paralyze you, please. We as Americans are cursed in some way because we're responsible for this, but we're also privileged in that we can stop it very easily. We don't have to invade anybody. We don't have to kill anybody. We just say, no, you're done. That's it.
The least listeners can do, and their friends and relatives, is register their objection to their two senators' representatives, 202-224-3121. That's the switchboard. Then ask for your representative senators. The Congress has gone back home for the rest of the weeks until the elections. They're going to be coursing through your neighborhood, your community, shaking hands, give them a piece of your mind. They do get affected by this. There are more people critical of Israel now in Congress than there was a year ago. So do your part. We've been speaking with Dr. Feroze Sidhwa, who's come back from Gaza, along with dozens of other heroic American doctors, and who have penned collectively a letter to the President of the United States about what they found and what they're urgently recommending in terms of a ceasefire, humanitarian aid, and a long-term settlement of the conflict. They received no response from the White House. Thank you very much for your ongoing efforts, Feroze, because you just keep going and going along with those of your valiant colleagues until you break through.
Thank you all.
I want to thank our guests again, Trita Parsi and Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Anna Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Camp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Be active. Got a few weeks left for the campaign to end in November.
Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too high. Wow. Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person.